Jesus. Many people today view the Old Testament as a workings founded largely on Sumerian and Babylonian myths and legends. You find the existence throughout history of sun god worship, not the Son of God, worshipping the sun god. You find reptilian or serpent worship. You look at the Ming dynasty in China, or the Egyptian royal court of the dragon, where the worship of the snake or the serpent was something which was common. And what happened is that subsequently individuals, in fact today presently, people such as Sir Lawrence Gardner, who in fact engages in many of these mystery school rituals. You have many secret societies like Knights of the Hospitals of St. John, Opus Dei, the Bohemian Grove, and so on, where they incorporate these particular pagan rituals. And if you analyze them and study them, you find many of them are the sources for the historical account in respect of Jesus. In fact, here you have a picture. This particular picture was discovered. It was a statue which was discovered in modern-day Iraq in the 1920s by an archaeologist called Leonard Woolsey. But it's quite interesting because it puts forth, it's a reptilian being, and in the arms of this particular figurine is a child. And when you study the Sumerian and the Babylonian myths, you would find that the child here was said to have been conceived by miraculous means. Reptilian worship. Here you find, this is in Temple Bar in London, again the same principle, which these are gargoyles which are found in France. But interestingly enough, that you look at the so-called concept of the Virgin Mary, and you analyze history, and you find in what archaeologists have discovered, that you find similar accounts in history. This is one particular example of what they call a half snake with a child in the midst, virgin birth. You find again so-called mother goddesses in history. In fact, all the attributes, if you look at the Babylonian Trinity, you look at Babylonian civilization, ancient Babylonian culture and religion, the ancient Babylonians believed in a Trinity. And that Trinity was of Nimrod the father, Tammuz, who was the son, and Semiramis, Queen Semiramis, the Virgin Mother, and that was subsequently transposed into Greco-Roman belief. Today you find that Nimrod is worshipped in various symbolic forms in places such as the Bohemian Grove, in which the owl, or which is a symbol of Moloch, basically is transformed as a particular type of sun god, and many people engage in that particular type of worship. We'll come to that in a minute. But as I stated, if you look at these mother goddesses in histories, all the attributes, for example, that the Babylonians gave to Queen Semiramis, that's this lady here. This is Queen Semiramis, with the child conceived through miraculous means, through the virgin birth. That particular lady was called in history in certain accounts as Virgin Mother, Queen of Heaven, Our Lady, which translates as Madonna. In other words, if you heard of the Madonna of the Rocks, the actual painting by Da Vinci, and the Notre Dame, and later on those particular writings were transferred into the myths which were created surrounding the Virgin Mary. The Ubaid culture, as I stated previously, worshipped a certain people, and as I showed earlier on, the reptilian mother and child were found in the grave when they were being dug up by respective archaeologists. Unraveling the specific story is fascinating when you begin to realize that the so-called different gods and goddesses around the world are essentially the same deity. Queen Semiramis and Mother Goddess worship, you find the same thing in India. You find the Mother Goddess here, Devkasi, with the infant Krishna, again through virgin birth. You find similar accounts, the Egyptian goddess Isis and the son Horus. Here you find the Roman Catholic Mary and the incarnate God Jesus, and so on. These were different goddesses in Ephesus. But the point is that there are parallels. So what does this tell us? This tells us that there is a particular kind of a common consciousness amongst various civilizations where they incorporate these particular beliefs, and you find the parallels throughout history. So-called Virgin Marys in prehistory. Scandinavia, you had Disa with a virgin child, conceived with a virgin birth. In Egypt, Isis and the child Osiris. In India, Krishna and Devkasi. In Asia, Cybele and Dionysus. In Rome, you have the mother goddess Fortuna and Jupiter Pio, also all conceived by a virgin birth. In Greece, you have Ceres. You had the fruit juice Ceres, or Irene with a baby boy Plutus, all again conceived through miraculous means. Virgin Marys in prehistory, as I'd like to call them. Again, transposed, cross-pollinated, and people adopt these particular ideas and they incorporate these myths and you create a religion out of it. In fact, even in places like Tibet, China and Japan, when Jesuit missionaries entered these particular regions during the part of the 20th century, they were astonished to find the Roman counterpart of the Madonna and the Child, what the Chinese and the Japanese called Xingmu, the Holy Mother. The Holy Mother was portrayed with a child in her arms and glory around her, like the halo, which I'll also show further on in the particular diagrams, as you will see. And so, largely based on these particular parallels, many researchers, including people such as S. Acharya, in a book, The Christ Conspiracy, people like Bruce Bauer and so on, they argued that in actual fact the true founder of Christianity was an Alexandrian Jew called Philo. And so these particular writers, of course we don't agree with them, but as a result of the conclusions they've reached, they've stated that this particular Jesus was a fiction. He was a fiction, he didn't exist, he was something which was developed at a later point in time. Interestingly enough, this was what I had mentioned earlier on, the Bohemian Grove, which is a forest in a part in California. It's a forest about 100-acre wood in California, which is privately owned. And in 2000, we had the investigative journalist Alex Jones. This particular discussion was dealt with in a documentary called The Secret Rulers of the World. And he infiltrated this particular area. And in that space, what he came across was the same, in a sense, the same pagan sun worship, the same Babylonian pagan sun worship. He found the existence at that particular time in these particular areas. For example, this was what we call the cremation of Ke. Here we have a picture of an owl, a statue of a 14-foot owl, which symbolized Nimrod, who was also the sun god, being worshipped. And of course you have an effigy of burning that takes place. Again, some kind of obeisance, if I may state, or significance in terms of worship of the pagan sun gods. And when you look at the history of that, you find there's not much difference in respect of how Jesus in the New Testament has been reconstructed. But interestingly enough, who are some of the attendees at these particular functions? We have here, Nixon, Reagan and Glenn Seaborg, who was the founder of plutonium. Here we have an image which took place in 1957. Again, this particular festival which takes place in July, where the worship of the pagan sun god, or allegedly, if you look at many mainstream journalists, they would tell you, well, this is just some kind of boys club, like the Skull and Bones Society at Yale University and so on. But this was an image which was captured in 1957. This was about more than 20 years before Reagan became president, and at least more than a decade before Nixon became president. And standing up there was Glenn Seaborg, who was the founder of plutonium, the actual bomb which was utilized, in fact, to cause the devastation in Hiroshima, leading to the deaths and mass murders of close to 1 million people. But the point is, you find, as a passing remark, these are the type of attendees that you have at conferences and functions such as this. So Jesus the myth, as I've stated, based on what I've produced, as a result of these parallels, many have doubted of the existence, the historical existence of Jesus Christ. Rudolf Bultmann, in 1941, he wrote a book called The Problem of Demythologizing the New Testament. And what he basically stated was, he called on interpreters to replace the traditional theology of the New Testament with the works and the writings of a philosopher called Martin Heidegger, because he saw parallels there. You find Joseph Wallace in his book in 1930 called Forgery in Christianity, went even further and stated that there was an active effort to forge documents. There was an active effort to forge documents and to make the myth seem as historical, beginning as early as the 2nd century. You go on further, John Allegro, who was a translator of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he was subsequently brutally murdered based on his ideas. In 1970 he proposed that Christianity was something which was a shamanistic religion based on the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms. Now, if you look at the shamans, the so-called witch doctors or the sangomas, he stated that this basically evolved out of a combination of Gnosticism that was basically floating around. And so Jesus never existed. This is his idea based on the myth.